All right, we've covered humor, we've covered laughter, and now it's time to talk about satire. Satire is an ancient form of critique traced back to early Greek theater. It entails the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's hypocrisy or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other topical issues. As I mentioned earlier with topicality, a lot of it overlaps with satire. Satire demands justice through humor. Satire is an outsider art that seeks to mock those in power and take down the establishment, disestablishmentarianism, by pointing out the difference between how things are currently and how things should be ideally. So satirists are idealists who are advocating for change by humorously and concisely comparing our current state of affairs with how things should be. Satire conveys the idea that we shouldn't accept things as they are and that we should strive for something better. The most iconic historical example of a satirical work is Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. So this is during the time where the Irish were going through lots of poverty and a famine, the Irish famine, and they were treated as like a lower colony by the British. So the Irish satirical writer Jonathan Swift wrote this essay, and the whole tone of the essay is, oh, how do we help these poor people? These poor, backwards people. I propose a modest intervention where we simply eat the children of the Irish. That way, it can solve multiple problems. It can solve the famine problem and also the overpopulation problem in Ireland. And I remember having to read this essay in high school, and the entire thing is written in that sarcastic tone. And it's that contrast between his serious tone and the ridiculous subject matter that creates that absurdity and points out just how absurd the way the Irish have been treated. Like, that's what satire does. It exaggerates it. Like, the British obviously aren't getting the Irish to eat their own children, but Swift took it to that exaggerated level to point out that even without going that far, the British are still treating the Irish as second-class citizens. Sometimes you need to take it to that extreme degree to point out less extreme injustices. And the way Swift delivered it in this satirical manner was very effective for conveying social and political commentary. And a lot of future satirical works have been based on the template offered by Swift's Modest Proposal, to the point where even the term modest proposal is often in reference to Swift's original works, so you can probably bet that anything with modest proposal in its title will be a satirical work. So political satire roughly consists of three elements. The first one is criticizing those in power. So when a politician is in power and they're beloved by all, which is rare, or when the nation is feeling content with where they are, or if there's fear of an outside threat, then being against your political leaders is tough to pull off. But in times of political dissatisfaction, where the population isn't preoccupied with other concerns and they have more time and attention to devote to criticizing their own leaders, then there's a greater hunger for political humor that rails against those politicians and those in positions of power. This helps to explain the rise of satire during the first decades of the 21st century, when shows like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart or the Colbert Report sprung into popularity while conservative US President George W. Bush was in power. George W. Bush was a gold mine of political satire and just jokes in general, to the point where a lot of political comedians lamented the fact that Obama became president after George W. Bush, not for political reasons, but for comedy reasons. Because it's much harder to make Obama and the liberal left the butt of jokes compared to Bush and the conservative right. Bush was really the golden era for late night talk show hosts and political satirists. And we just concluded the orange era, thankfully. And I guess we've entered into the gray era now. The second element or feature of political satire is exposing hypocrisy. There's something intensely satisfying about seeing a public figure who proclaims to be holier than thou, only for them to get their comeuppance when it's revealed that behind the scenes they are corrupt and self-serving and liars. It's that juicy gotcha moment when someone's double standards are finally exposed for everyone to see. So like a politician whose public message is all about saving the environment. They're really preachy and think they're better than everyone else because they proclaim to care about the environment. And then a candid camera video of that politician littering is leaked so everyone can point at that politician and laugh at their hypocrisy. That's a pretty innocuous example, but usually it's a lot more scandalous things. Like a governor with a hard stance on prostitution is caught soliciting a prostitute. That's literally happened more than once at very high levels of politics. And it's like, come on, if you're going to make that your one thing to base your political platform on, is it really that difficult to avoid doing that one thing? Like, they're making easy targets of themselves. So the satirist is pointing out hypocrisy and pointing out double standards. So recently, Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, made that reconciliation holiday. And the first year that this was a national holiday, Trudeau took advantage of that to go to his cottage in Tofino for a nice long weekend getaway. And I remember reading this very sarcastic, satirical article about weekend getaways for when you're an irresponsible prime minister. Hey there, are you a prime minister who just made a holiday proclaiming to care about Indigenous issues? Well, you obviously don't want to spend that day actually interacting with Indigenous groups. So here's a list of vacation getaways so you can spend your Reconciliation Day surfing instead of being prime minister. And all those politicians who told everyone not to travel during the pandemic and then they got caught traveling to like Cuba and Mexico for Christmas. There's many ways of dealing with it. You can point and yell at them and how angry you are at them for breaking their own rules. Or you can deliver your criticism in a more effective manner through satire and social commentary, which leads us to the third feature of political satire, anger. But not just anger, properly channeled anger. Comedic anger tends to be motivated by a situation that's wrong or a politician who's doing something wrong. Humor is one mechanism by which anger can be constructively processed rather than destructive. The kind of unconstrained anger that's hostile or personally attacking or cruel isn't funny. So when jokes emanate from that place, they won't be very successful. So you want to be angry because anger is what motivates you to see an unjust situation and to comment on it. But if you're too angry, that could lead to ad hominem attacks or antagonism, which weakens the humor, as it's instead interpreted not as funny or satirical, but as aggressive and hostile, and thus it loses its comedic effect and the impact of its social message is weakened. So satirists have to be angry, but point out the cause of their anger in a calm, casual, funny, witty, relatable way. So satirists deftly and strategically hone their anger at a situation they view as wrong, but they mask their vitriol with a kinder tone so they don't come off as hostile or petty to their audience, which is detrimental for getting an audience to laugh and emphasize with the satirist point of view. So it's a fine line you have to tread because you need to be a little bit angry because that's what gives you the passion for pursuing that satirical communication. But you can't let it cross the line into unbridled anger that's no longer funny. And it's also not seen as funny when someone in a position of power makes fun of someone lower than them. It's referred to as punching downwards because they're beating up a weaker opponent who can't defend themselves, which isn't very enjoyable for spectators to watch. Like, stop. This isn't fair or enjoyable. You're kicking someone while they're down. So comedians never want to punch downwards. They always try to punch upwards and fight the powers that be. As Mark Maron says, the voice of the victim is much funnier than the voice of the oppressor. People would rather cheer for an underdog. Because of its disestablishmentarianism quality, satire works best when it originates from people who are being mistreated. If the person who's doing the mistreating is also the one who's joking, then that's like borderline bullying. But humor and comedy and satire is the weapon of the mistreated. It's the weapon of the underdog. It's one of the resources we have available to us to mock those in power and to mock those with a clear advantage. Like, it's sort of a comedic standard to jokingly and humorously complain about abuse or rejection or no respect. Like the famous comedian Rodney Dangerfield. His trademark line was, "Hey, I don't get no respect. My wife doesn't respect me, my kids don't respect me." Rodney Dangerfield wouldn't be nearly as funny as if he said, "Hey, I get a lot of respect. Everyone respects me." The rich and the powerful already have plenty of resources and abilities when it comes to shaping discourse and controlling communication. Humor and satire is one of the only resources and weapons available to the powerless to use against the powerful. Criticism against those in power is funnier than humor that comes from the political or social elites themselves. If you're mocking the powers that be, you can't be the powers that be. If you're a member of the establishment already, then there's nothing for you to mock, and everything you do mock is something you control. So who are you complaining to? You're basically complaining to yourself, since you're complaining about a situation that you yourself have constructed deliberately and are actively in control of and actually have the power to change. It's like if the elevator in my apartment breaks and the landlord who owns the building is too cheap to spend money on fixing it, but then he starts hanging around the lobby complaining to all the tenants about how he has to take the stairs and says, "Hey, someone really needs to fix this elevator." Like, yeah, dude, you're the landlord. It's your responsibility. But you're sitting here complaining about the problem that you created and that you have the power to fix. So what's the point in complaining to all the people who are suffering because of your decision, who don't have the power, but are negatively affected by the situation you fabricated? People will tend to find different things funny depending on their political leanings. So whether they're a liberal or conservative will partially influence their sense of humor, what they consider humorous, and what they enjoy watching for entertainment. Liberals tend to side with the poor and the powerless and push for change, which makes the liberal political ideology better suited for humor. Whereas conservatives want to conserve the existing social structures and keep things as they currently are, which isn't conducive to humor or satire, which is about complaining about how things currently are and how things could be better. So the liberal political ideology is more aligned with humor and satire and can be used for the political purposes of liberals to not only complain about the status quo, but complain about conservatives and poke fun at them for wanting to preserve the status quo. That's not to say that when liberals are in power, they're immune from political jokes. They're still very much viable targets. Even though they're liberal leaning, as long as they're in power, then they're fair game for political satire. So Trudeau and Biden get their fair share of jokes levied at them. So there's not really anything about the conservative political ideology that lends itself to humorous communication. That's not to say that all conservatives are unfunny, just that most conservatives are unfunny. And the conservatives that are funny are usually only funny when they're talking about stuff completely unrelated to their political leanings. And conservatives are just a more easy target of satire. Like, you think of the caricature picture of Republicans, they kind of look like the Monopoly man with the monocle and the top hat and the cane. That's a readily identifiable, commonly held image. And again, it's an image that's easy to poke fun at. When I think of a liberal, I can't even think of an image in that same way. Liberals and conservatives also have very different entertainment interests. They watch completely different TV shows and go to completely different sources online or elsewhere for their everyday information and entertainment. You'd think with the proliferation of digital media that there'd be more opportunities for people on either side of the political spectrum to look and see the other side and understand where it's coming from. But instead, the inundation of information sources exacerbates the echo chamber effect on the internet, so that liberals never need to see a conservative piece of media. There's plenty of liberal media out there for them to consume their news or consume their entertainment. And all those things will reinforce their existing biases. They'll comfort them and make them believe that their ideology is the right one. And the same thing with the conservative side. Never the twain shall meet, which leads to even more isolation of ideas and political divisiveness, as there's an increasing degree of confirmation bias and hyper specialization of niches of entertainment and comedy that people consume, so that you can only stick to your niche, or you only need to stick to your niche, and there's plenty of stuff for you to consume, plenty of media entertainment within that very specific niche, thus limiting the sources of information we have about our world and narrowing our perspective of the world and precluding us from being open to new ideas and receptive to ideas that don't align with our pre-existing conceptions.